I always wondered if a man knows the exact moment his life ceases to belong to him. For me, it wasn't the car crash that scattered my ribs like dry twigs. It was the night Lila pressed her forehead to mine, her breath warm with secrets she never spoke. She said she loved me. Only once, then turned her face away as if loving me was a blemish she could hide under her father's ancient rules. I remember everything with cruel clarity, how she traced her finger along the stubble on my jaw, whispering my name like an apology. How she cried when the first marriage proposal arrived, arranged neatly between her father's ambition and her mother's fear of scandal. How I laughed it off, so sure I could bend the world around my hunger for her. Some men drink poison slowly. Mine was her silence. She didn't argue when they fixed her wedding date to a man she barely knew, but whose family tree sprawled over the city like a protective shadow. She didn't run to me. She didn't even look back when I asked her to. That night, under the flickering streetlight behind her house, I stood with my palms open like a beggar, and she dropped my heart right into the gutter with one final trembling nod. They called it sacrifice. I called it betrayal. I suppose I'm supposed to blame her father, or fate, or this city that feeds on broken love stories like a stray dog on bones. But I blame myself, because even then, inside my bruised chest, I knew I would die loving her, even when she knelt before another man, promised him children, wealth, devotion. I thought I'd get over it. I thought I'd rebuild my name, my sanity. I thought wrong. I found ways to erase her, a new city, a new job. Nights blurred with the taste of strangers who never asked for promises. But every mirror spat her reflection back at me, the girl with dusk in her eyes and the weight of other people's choices crushing her spine. If you'd asked me last year if I believed in ghosts, I would have laughed. But tonight, as my ribs crack like cheap porcelain and blood fills the hollow cave of my mouth, I realize some ghosts walk beside you while you're still breathing. I wish I could tell you I let her go with grace. I didn't. Even as my pulse weakens, I want her to hurt the way she taught me to hurt. I want her to remember the warmth of my hands long after the gold bangles of her arranged life have turned to rust. Death isn't my ending. It's the beginning of the last conversation we never finished. If you believe dying makes you wiser, you're wrong. It makes you a spectator of your own ruin, forced to watch the rot you ignored, the lies you swallowed because they tasted sweeter than the truth. They buried me 2 weeks after the accident, a neat grave on the city's forgotten edge, where weeds keep secrets better than people do. My mother wept until her voice gave out. My father didn't. He just stared at my tombstone like it was a bill he hadn't expected to pay so soon. But Lila, she did not come. I watched her from the other side. Whatever you call this limbo, this cruel vantage point where the living never feel you but the dead feel everything. She stood by her bedroom window that day, draped in bridal red, mouth clamped shut like a prisoner who had bitten her own tongue. Her husband, Rafik, sat in her vanity, texting someone who was not her. I laughed when I realized the irony. She had traded a love that suffocated her gently for a cage that didn't bother with tenderness at all. At first I pitied her. Then I saw deeper. Rafik was not simply inattentive. He was methodical. He liked power more than love, the certainty of owning something beautiful rather than nurturing it. He paraded her at parties like a trophy, yet behind closed doors he dismantled her piece by piece, reminding her that her father's debts were paid with her silence and obedience. He reminded her that a woman who breaks tradition breaks her mother's bones too. She told no one. She smiled at dinner tables, poured tea for in-laws who clucked about grandchildren. But alone she wrote letters, dozens of them, all to me, addressed to a grave that could not answer. She hid them under her mattress, ink smudged by tears she would never let her mother see. I read every word. My death gave me access to the room she locked tight in life. I watched her beg the wind for forgiveness she'd never earn. I watched her hold the photo of us she'd told Rafik she'd burned long ago. And something inside me twisted, a jagged, hungry thing that refused to forgive just because I was gone. You see, betrayal is not a single act. It's an ecosystem of quiet choices. Lila betrayed me when she let fear dictate her vows. Her father betrayed her when he sold her future. Rafiq betrayed everyone when he slid a ring onto her finger, knowing he'd never love her, only own her. And I betrayed myself when I mistook her cowardice for sacrifice. But the dead are nothing if not patient. I had time, endless corridors of it, to learn how the living mind works when it thinks no one is watching. I knew where Rafiq spent his nights when he left her alone in their king-size bed. I knew the girl he paid for affection, a student half his age who called him "sir," even when he bruised her mouth with his kisses. I knew the uncle who loaned him the money for the wedding in exchange for favors that would one day choke him with obligation. Piece by piece, I charted the frail scaffolding of Rafiq's pride, and then I found my foothold in Lila's heart again. The cracks she thought she'd sealed when she signed the marriage papers. Guilt, regret, desire she never buried deep enough. One night she whispered into the dark, believing no one heard, "If you're still here, I'm sorry. I'd undo it all. I'd run. I'd die with you if I could." I wanted to forgive her. I did. But forgiveness is a balm for the living. The dead crave retribution because it's the only way to taste warmth again. So I visited her dreams. At first, only shadows at the edge of her vision, a shape behind her mirror, a whisper when she stepped from the bath. She blamed exhaustion. Then I spoke her name the way only I ever did. Not Mrs. Rafiq, not daughter of Malik, but simply Lila. The name she once sighed into my throat as if it was her confession and absolution both. She began to wake screaming, sweat soaking the neckline of her wedding sheets. She thought she was going mad. She prayed louder, but prayers don't banish ghosts that come carrying the truth. Meanwhile, Rafiq's secrets bloomed like mold under a damp rug. Anonymous tips to the girl's father, receipts delivered to Leila's father's doorstep, inked with hotel names and times, a photo left under her pillow, her husband's lips pressed to another woman's ear, his hand curled around a thigh that wasn't hers. I could have destroyed him outright, but where's the poetry in that? Betrayal deserves an audience, and so I watched Lila break open under the weight of her illusions. The perfect husband, the honorable family, the dutiful daughter who paid for her parents' dignity with her own ruin. In life, I could never hurt her. In death, I became the mirror she could no longer turn away from. Every time she closed her eyes, I reminded her who she used to be. The girl who kissed me behind her father's garden shed, swore we'd run away together, swore she'd never bow to fear. I dragged her back to that version of herself, inch by bloody inch. Not out of mercy, but because when she stood face to face with what she'd lost, I knew she'd destroy the cage she once chose over me. And when that happened, Rafiq would finally see what betrayal tastes like when it turns on its master. For months, she tried to fight me, or the idea of me, with prayer beads clutched so tight the ridges carved raw lines into her palms. She fasted. She lit incense her grandmother claimed would cleanse the house of restless spirits. She whispered to a cleric that she felt a shadow leaning over her bed at night, breathing secrets she had buried beside my bones. But she could not starve out guilt. She could not scrub away memory. The more she struggled to cleanse herself of my ghost, the more vividly she remembered what it felt like to belong to me. Not to her father's ledgers nor her husband's ring, but to that tender cruelty we once called love. By now, Rafiq was unraveling in broad daylight. He slammed doors. He shouted at servants over imaginary faults. He locked his phone the way a criminal clutches an alibi. And Lila, once so eager to bow and hush, stood in doorways she used to flee from. She watched him the way a snake watches a farmer's bare ankle, patient, cold-blooded, unblinking. I hovered in the walls of that house, proud of her rage because it smelled so much like mine. One evening, while the monsoon battered the city in sheets of silver, she found the courage to test him. She lifted his phone from the nightstand while he snored, drunk and half-naked beside her. One swipe, one password she knew in her gut, and the floodgates opened. Videos, messages. A girl not much older than she had been when she first knelt before my crooked grin and swore she'd never belonged to another. I could feel her pulse hammer as she scrolled through months of filth he'd buried in a device he thought would keep him invincible. Her throat pulsed with an old scream. The ones she never gave voice to when her father dictated her wedding date, when her mother dabbed rose oil behind her ears and told her to obey. But now she obeyed only her own fury. In the morning, she served him tea laced with sleeping pills strong enough to put him under for hours. She didn't want him dead, not yet, but helpless enough to learn that some wives know how to be ruthless when cornered. She rifled through his drawers, bank statements, and property deeds. She discovered how he siphoned money to cover debts, how he forged signatures on contracts that would bury her father's business in scandal if exposed. And she laughed, a sound not sweet or fragile, but sharp, the first honest sound she'd made in years. Meanwhile, I worked my poison into her sleep. Nightly, I replayed our first kiss behind her childhood garden, the way her fingers trembled against my collar when she said, "I'd follow you anywhere." I gave her dreams of me walking toward her through a field of graves, the city skyline behind my back like a kingdom we once promised each other. In these dreams, she wept and begged forgiveness. I gave her none, because what was forgiveness to me now? I was breathless dust. All I wanted was to tear apart the fortress she'd built on my grave. Rafiq, for all his cunning, was too arrogant to suspect the storm gathering inside his wife's bones. He still flaunted her at family dinners, oblivious to how her eyes no longer shone with timid devotion, but with the steely sheen of a woman who had learned to devour her fear whole. Her father, once so proud of selling her into wealth, began to sense the crack in the facade when rumors drifted through bizarre gossip. Whispers that Rafiq's business dealings stank of fraud, that his so-called charity donations were covered for bribes, that the girl he kept on the side was telling her friends about the bruises he left behind expensive hotel curtains. I watched Lila the day she slipped a voice recorder under Rafiq's office desk. She sat across from him while he spewed half-truths into his phone, lying to investors, mocking her father's weakness to an old friend on speakerphone. She did not flinch when he called her a good puppet wife who would never dare betray him, not knowing he'd just handed her the rope to hang him in front of the entire city. When she returned to her bedroom that night, she sat at the edge of her marital bed, playing my voice in her mind the way one hums a forbidden hymn. She whispered into the dark, "I wish you'd stayed. I wish I'd run with you. Would you have forgiven me?" I lay beside her, my presence a hush of cold air that made her skin pebble. "No," I thought, brushing invisible lips along her hairline. "But I will help you end this." The next days were a frenzy of clandestine meetings. A lawyer, bribed with hush money and the promise of scandal big enough to fuel his career for a decade. A trusted maid slipping envelopes to a journalist who'd sell his mother for a taste of a rich man's downfall. And always behind every door she closed softly, I hovered. My death a constant reminder that love unprotected by resolve dies screaming in its sleep. One dawn she found herself in front of my grave. Her driver thought she'd gone to pray for a child. He waited at a respectful distance, engine humming. She knelt in the wet grass, fingertips tracing the letters of my name carved into stone too soon. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, the first honest prayer she'd uttered since I bled out alone on that rain-slick road. "If you can hear me, stay with me. Please don't leave me now." But I had never left. I would not leave until the last of her chains rattled to the floor. Back home, she sat across from Rafik at breakfast, wearing the silk sari he'd once forced her to wear to impress his partners. She poured him tea with hands that did not tremble. When he looked up, puzzled by her calm, she smiled. A real smile, one he'd never seen. He didn't know the trap was already coiled tight around his throat. Documents copied, recordings backed up in 3 places, the lawyer ready to strike with a scandal that would salt every inch of Rafiq's carefully manicured reputation. She was no longer the sacrificial lamb, she was the knife. Meanwhile, I felt something strange stir inside the cold cavity where my heart used to be. Pride, satisfaction, or perhaps the cruelest twist of all, love, still snarled in my ribs, refusing to rot even after everything. But there was no turning back now. Betrayal was done pretending to be sorrowful. It would taste like blood and freedom this time, and she would not be the only one set free when the sun rose on Rafik's ruin. It happened on a Thursday. The city woke to thunder that rattled glass and made dogs whimper under gates. Rain hammered rooftops like a warning drumbeat. And inside that gilded house, Lila once called her cage, the final betrayal brewed like poison in a decanter. Rafiq swaggered in just before dawn, reeking of sweat and cheap perfume. He found her awake, combing her hair in front of the vanity she'd once watched him claim for his mistress's trinkets. Up early, he slurred, smirking at her reflection. He had no clue she'd spent the night finalizing her escape, sewing shut every pocket of leverage he believed would keep her docile. She turned calm as a grave. "We need to talk, Rafiq." He laughed, that bark of condescension he reserved for women and servants. "I'm tired, we'll talk tonight." But she blocked his path to the bed, no tremor in her voice, no flinching when he raised his brow like a king, inconvenienced by a peasant's nerve. "Sit," she said. A single word. Command, not plea. He obeyed, not because he feared her, but because underestimating her was the cornerstone of his cruelty. She laid the evidence before him. Photos, financial ledgers, the voice recording of him bragging about money laundered through dummy charities. The grainy video of him with his lover, laughing about how he'd ruin Lila's father if she ever stepped out of line. He snorted, flicking the photos aside. "Empty threats, sweetheart. Who will believe you over me?" From the shadowed corner of the room, I wanted to howl at him. A beast denied its kill too long. Leela simply tilted her head. "Not threats, Rafiq. Facts. Facts delivered to the Daily Herald at dawn. Facts I've secured with 3 lawyers and a public notary. If anything happens to me, this city will spit your name like poison until you choke on it." Rafiq's laugh died in his throat. The color left his face in drips, like ink bleeding through wet paper. He lunged, brute reflex, fingers at her throat. She didn't scream. She didn't even fight. She stared into his eyes as her windpipe pinched shut, and in that gaze he saw it, the death of his power. I threw myself at him then. Not flesh, but wrath made shape. Mirrors cracked, windows groaned. The storm outside exploded against the glass like an army battering gates. He stumbled back, clutching his head as if my scream were nails burrowing into his skull. She coughed, air rushing back. "Do it," she rasped. "Kill me, and bury yourself next to me when they drag your carcass to court." He broke them. It was not my ghost, nor her proof, nor the storm that unmade him. It was her eyes, the calm of a woman who no longer feared death because she'd lived it once already, in my coffin. He fell to his knees, whining about forgiveness, begging like a dog that senses its master has changed hands. She left him there, crumpled and sniveling. She didn't look back. Downstairs, the servants watched her glide past. No longer the docile bride, but the mistress of her own ruin and redemption. Some whispered prayers as if she carried a god's fury in her veins. They weren't wrong. She stepped out into the rain, lifting her face to the sky I could never feel again. Her sari clung to her shoulders, hair curling around her throat like a lover's fingers. She smiled through tears that tasted of salt and freedom. And I, who had haunted her nights, felt my edges begin to dissolve. The hunger for vengeance that had stitched me to this earth began to loosen, thread by burning thread. She turned as if she felt me in the storm, whispered to the wind, "I'm free now. You can rest." I wanted to tell her I'd never truly rest, that even the dead envy the living who dare to reclaim themselves. But instead I drifted closer, pressing one final kiss, weightless, cold, to the crown of her wet head. She shivered, smiled wider, walked away without once glancing at the house she'd turned into a grave for a tyrant still breathing inside it. Behind her, Rafiq would wake the police at his gate. Papers would splash his disgrace in black ink across every cafe table. Her father would grovel for her forgiveness. She might give it or not. She owed no one that mercy anymore. As for me, I have a memory now. The last secret she would keep tucked in the warm nest of her ribs. No longer her ghost, but her reminder. Some loves never die. They become the fire that burns your cage to ash. In the days that followed, the city devoured Rafiq like a jackal tearing rotten meat. Headlines bled across every newsstand. Business magnate faces embezzlement and assault allegations. His mugshot, swollen-eyed, hollow, stripped of the smug grin he wore at galas, reminded the world that money could buy obedience, but not loyalty, not forever. Lila did not watch the news. She didn't need to. She had seen him fall before the first camera ever flashed. His real ruin was not the courts or the journalists or the creditors sniffing at his carcass. It was that a woman he believed to be a doll had carved her freedom with his own secrets. She didn't return to her father's house either. The first evening after the scandal broke, her father called a dozen times, each ring carrying old promises. "Come home, Lila. We'll fix this. You can't survive alone." She let it ring until the battery died. Instead, she sat alone in the empty living room, the place that once felt like a cage padded in silk. Now it was just bricks and air. She sipped tea in the quiet, hearing no footsteps she had to shrink away from, no voice barking her name like an order. The silence was not loneliness. It was proof she had survived her own burial. I lingered near the ceiling, a fading echo in corners where her nightmares used to nest. In life, I'd been her reckless salvation. Her ruin, too. In death, I'd been her shadow, stitching her rage to my unavenged bones. Now, watching her pour another cup with steady hands, I felt the slow tearing loose of my final tether to this world. She did not beg me to stay anymore. She didn't have to. Part of me would live on each time she crossed a threshold without permission, each time she signed her name on a contract with no father or husband to forge it for her. A week later, she visited my grave again, this time at dawn, when the city was still half dreaming. She brought no flowers. Instead, she brought her confession, laid out in soft words between us in the first light rising behind her. "I loved you. I always did. I just wasn't brave enough to lose everything for you." She touched the cold stone, forehead resting there as if to borrow my calm. "Maybe I needed you to die to learn how to live for myself. I'm sorry, I forgive you too." The wind caught her hair, tangled it across her cheek. She laughed through tears. It wasn't bitter anymore, just honest. She rose without ceremony, no weeping farewell, no whispered plea to keep haunting her dreams. She walked away lighter than I'd ever seen her, a woman whose scars no longer dictated her choices, but reminded her how much pain she could bear and still rise. As she stepped back onto the dirt path, she passed a gardener laying fresh seeds near my headstone. She paused, knelt, and pressed one trembling palm flat over the earth that held what remained of me. "Thank you." Just that. No promise to return tomorrow. No vow to mourn me forever. Love is not meant to be a chain binding the living to the grave. I drifted higher with that thought, a warmth I hadn't known even when my heart still pumped blood through reckless veins. She had taken everything I was, the man who dreamed too big, loved too fiercely, died too young, and turned it into her armor. I could ask for no softer death than this gentle fading. She left the city soon after, packed no more than a single suitcase. She sold the house to pay off the last threads of debt, donated the rest to a shelter for girls who'd been traded like cattle the way she once was. She didn't tell her father where she was going. She didn't tell anyone. Some nights he still calls, leaves voicemails asking her to forgive him for choosing pride over her freedom, tradition over her heart. She never replies. Some truths deserve silence, not reconciliation. In a coastal town far enough that the old city is a rumor, she rented a small flat above a bookstore. She learned how to run her own business. Something modest, something hers alone. The townsfolk gossip about the beautiful widow who smiles but never flirts, who walks barefoot on the sand at dusk and, sometimes, when the wind is right, seems to be speaking to someone no one else can see. If they ask her if she'll marry again, she laughs and says, "I'm already married to my life." Some nights when the ocean breathes against her window, she lies awake and lets herself remember a boy with wild dreams and soft lies whispering against her throat. She lets herself miss me, but only briefly, because regret is not her shroud anymore. It is just a single thread in a new tapestry she weaves, day by quiet day. And me? I am nowhere now, and everywhere she dares to step. No longer a ghost chained to the past, but the secret proof that sometimes a man's love outlives his body, not to bind a woman to his grave, but to push her toward a horizon she was once too afraid to touch alone. For support, do like, comment, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.